A deathbed can be a lonely throne. In the winter of 1602, Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England, Ireland, and the last of the House of Tudor, sat slumped in a velvet-strewn chamber at Richmond Palace, refusing to speak, refusing to sleep, and refusing to die. She was not merely a sovereign in her final days, she was a symbol unraveling. The Virgin Queen, who once stood as an icon of English defiance, grandeur, and divine strength, was now a silent, withered figure, surrounded by flickering candles and uneasy courtiers. She had ruled for 44 years. She had stared down assassins, popes, and the Spanish Armada, but this was a different kind of enemy, one that no courtly charm, no clever speech, no stroke of political mastery could defeat. It was the creeping weight of time, of memory, of guilt. Her skin was pallid, her mind often adrift. She would not be moved. For days, she stood, motionless, staring at the shadows on the floor, as if willing her life to remain stitched to this earth through force alone. What happens when a woman who was treated as a living myth finally comes face to face with her own mortality? This is not the story of Elizabeth's triumphs. It is not the tale of the young queen who turned her court into a theater of power and poetry. This is the final act, the unraveling, the long, haunting descent into death, not just of a woman, but of an era. The Elizabethan age did not go quietly. It trembled, decayed, and grieved its own ending through the broken body of its namesake. Behind the golden portraits and the glorious speeches was a woman plagued by ghosts, of friends she had lost, of enemies she had outlived, of decisions she could never undo. Elizabeth was, to her last breath, both monarch and prisoner, trapped inside an image too large to escape and a body too fragile to sustain it. In this documentary, we trace the terrifying final days of England's most famous queen, not with spectacle or scandal, but with solemnity, insight, and historical truth. We will walk through her last chambers. We will hear the whispers of her closest attendants. We will see the shadow that falls when a great light begins to flicker. Elizabeth did not die a queen. She died a woman, exhausted, mournful, and afraid. And yet, in her silence, she spoke more of power, legacy, and human frailty than perhaps in all her orations combined. This is the end of Gloriana. There are monarchs, and then there are myths. From the moment Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne in 1558, the machinery of power began to transform her into something more than mortal. Her reign was not just political, it was theatrical, poetic, divine. She was Gloriana, Astrea, the Virgin Queen. Symbols carefully cultivated by artists, poets, and advisors to create a ruler who could not be touched, not even by time. And for decades, it worked. Elizabeth was the beating heart of a nation reborn from the chaos of religious war, dynastic insecurity, and continental threat. Under her leadership, England found a new identity: Protestant, proud, and poised to rise. She mastered the delicate art of power, maneuvering through assassination plots, treasonous lords, and male-dominated councils with a wit that disarmed and a resolve that frightened. She understood the fragility of her position from the start. A woman ruling alone in a patriarchal world, childless and unmarried, with a rival queen, Mary, Queen of Scots, declaring her illegitimate. Elizabeth didn't just hold the throne, she earned it every day, through sacrifice, spectacle, and severe calculation. But beyond the courtly rituals and public orations, there was something deeply personal about her reign, a desperate need to control how she was seen. She banned mirrors from her presence as she aged. Portraits were carefully edited to erase wrinkles and gray. Even her own words, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king," reveal the underlying truth. Elizabeth was always at war with time and the perception of weakness. Her virginity became state policy. Her unmarried status was not a vulnerability, but a divine calling. She was married, she insisted, to her people. Her court became a theater of flirtation and performance, her body politicized, her face immortalized. But what happens when a person becomes too large for the skin they wear? When the mask hardens and the human underneath begins to fade? Even as her fame grew, Elizabeth aged in secret. The tight curls of auburn hair were replaced by wigs. The white lead makeup, meant to signify purity, slowly poisoned her skin. Her teeth blackened, her hands trembled, but the myth endured because it had to. The stability of the nation depended on the illusion of her ageless divinity. Her advisors changed. Old companions died. Robert Dudley, her lifelong favorite, passed away in 1588, and with him went a great portion of her inner joy. She kept the letter he had written her just before his death in a locked box beside her bed for the rest of her life. By the time the 17th century approached, the golden age she had ushered in was already slipping into shadows. The court whispered of succession. The people wondered how long their queen could live. Foreign diplomats reported her frailty with a mixture of pity and anticipation. But Elizabeth refused to acknowledge the end. To speak of her death was treason. To plan for what came after her was, in her mind, a betrayal. And so she kept going, fiercely, stubbornly. She walked for hours each day. She insisted on standing during audiences. She gave rousing speeches, even when her voice faltered. She surrounded herself with pageantry and performance as if to delay the inevitable. To the public, she remained Gloriana, but privately, she was already haunted by memories, regrets, and the creeping awareness that her image had become a prison. This chapter of her life, the public facade of undying power, was not sustainable. The death of her closest confidants, the fading of her physical health, and the unrelenting pressure of holding together a kingdom on the edge of transition began to take their toll. By 1602, she was no longer the monarch who danced and dazzled the court. She was pale, withdrawn, and suspicious. Her courtiers noted how she flinched at shadows. She wept in solitude. Her sleep was disturbed, if it came at all. The monarch who had once declared she would live and die amongst her people was now slipping away from them, slowly, agonizingly, no longer able to keep up the charade. But still, she wore the crown. Still, she smiled for ambassadors. Still, she summoned strength for every trembling hand and aching bone. Elizabeth Tudor may have been mortal, but Elizabeth Regina, the Queen, refused to die quietly. She had ruled for over 4 decades. She had made herself into a myth. It is a cruel truth of power. The higher one climbs, the more isolated the summit. In the final years of Elizabeth I's life, her court became less a palace and more a mausoleum of memory. Richmond and Whitehall, once filled with music, debate, and dazzling performances, now echoed with the hushed steps of anxious courtiers. Gone were the days when the Queen commanded a room with a glance. Now, she sat wrapped in furs, her mind often elsewhere, her once fierce gaze dulled by exhaustion and loss. She was old, 70 by modern reckoning, an exceptional age in Tudor England, and she had ruled for almost that long. The body that had once danced into the early hours in embroidered gowns, that had led grand progresses through the countryside on horseback, was now failing her. Her face, once idealized in portraits as forever youthful, bore deep creases. The lead-based cosmetics she wore for decades had corroded her skin, leaving it pockmarked beneath the mask. Her hair, once auburn and thick, had thinned so drastically that she rarely appeared without a wig, each one carefully styled to maintain the illusion of vitality. And her teeth, blackened and decayed, prevented her from eating properly. She grew thin, not from choice, but necessity. Food lost its flavor, and her appetite along with it. She had outlived almost everyone who had mattered to her. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, her lifelong confidant and rumored love, was gone. She had clung to him for decades, the one man who could make her laugh, who understood the strange dance of affection and politics that defined her reign. When he died in 1588, she was inconsolable. The letter he wrote her before his death, filled with fondness and loyalty, was found locked away beside her deathbed, 15 years later, its edges worn by touch. Francis Walsingham, her spymaster, was gone. William Cecil, her trusted advisor and architect of so many state strategies, had passed, succeeded by his son Robert, whom Elizabeth never fully trusted. Even John Dee, the brilliant mathematician and mystic she had once relied upon for wisdom, had died in obscurity, his library plundered, his memory fading into irrelevance. In their place came younger men, ambitious, impatient, and far less affectionate. She felt the shift keenly. The court was no longer hers in spirit. There was reverence, yes, but little warmth. A quiet sense of waiting had settled across the nobility, waiting for her death and for the dawn of a new era. This knowledge, unspoken but palpable, weighed heavily on her. Elizabeth had spent her life avoiding the question of succession. She feared the talk of it would hasten her end or invite treason. But as she aged, the consequences of that avoidance began to gather. There was no heir, only James VI of Scotland, the son of her executed cousin Mary Stuart, loomed on the horizon. He was Protestant and politically savvy, but a man Elizabeth had never met, and perhaps never trusted. She was trapped, aging, alone, and burdened with the knowledge that her death would mark the collapse of the house her father, Henry VIII, had built through blood and ambition. The very thought of death unsettled her. She had survived more than her share of threats, conspiracies, foreign plots, illness, heartbreak. But now, death approached not as a sudden storm, but a slow fog creeping under the door. She could feel it, see it in the fearful eyes of those who came to visit her, hear it in the way ministers whispered outside her chamber. And so she began to retreat. She avoided public engagements, ceased her progress tours, and kept her private chambers dark and heavy with incense. She would sit for hours without speaking, lost in thought, eyes fixed on the floor. Her women would ask if she was ill, and she would wave them away. She refused to go to bed, standing for hours at a time, unwilling to lie down, for she believed if she did, she would never rise again. It was not just aging that frightened her, it was irrelevance. For Elizabeth, to rule was to exist. Without a throne, without attention, without purpose, who was she? She had sacrificed love, motherhood, and comfort for the crown. Now, at the end of her life, she was left with its lonely weight. There were no children to gather by her bed, no husband to hold her hand. Only servants, uneasy doctors, and anxious counselors circling like mourners long before the death. She grew paranoid. Once fiercely strategic and politically perceptive, she now began to suspect betrayal even in kindness. She saw omens in everything: sudden weather changes, the tone of a letter, the expressions on her attendants' faces. She asked after long-dead friends. She grew silent when James's name was mentioned. In this isolation, she turned inwards. She remembered. She grieved. Those who attended her reported sudden bursts of weeping, followed by long silences. She would recall the executions she had ordered, the wars she had fought, the lovers she had dismissed, the lives she had touched and changed and ended. The burden of her reign had always been extraordinary, but now its emotional toll came due. In these final seasons, Elizabeth ceased to be the omnipotent monarch. She was instead a widow of history, the last living relic of a dynasty whose grandeur had reached its final chapter. As Queen Elizabeth's health declined, so too did the stability of her court. For decades, her presence had kept rival factions in check, her intelligence, charisma, and strategic ambiguity turning would-be enemies into careful allies. But by the early 1600s, those once muted ambitions began to stir. With no named heir and the Queen retreating further from public life, the Tudor court became a simmering cauldron of anxiety and ambition. One question loomed above all others: who will rule after Elizabeth? The Queen had always resisted naming a successor. Her reasons were personal, political, and symbolic. To name an heir, she believed, would be to invite rebellion. It would make her mortal in the eyes of the court, and it would embolden ambitious nobles. As long as there was no future clearly laid out, she remained the only focus of loyalty, power, and hope. But this strategy, so brilliant in her youth, began to fail her in old age. With her ministers growing restless, a quiet consensus formed around one man: James VI of Scotland. The son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the cousin Elizabeth had executed, James was a Protestant king with a claim through Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. Though a foreigner in the eyes of many English courtiers, he was seen as a stabilizing choice. James had ruled Scotland for decades and had proven politically shrewd, if often insecure. Sir Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, took it upon himself to begin secret negotiations with James. This succession project, conducted without the Queen's explicit blessing, was both necessary and deeply dangerous. If discovered, it could be seen as treason. But Cecil, pragmatic and coldly devoted to the continuity of the state, believed it had to be done. Other nobles were not as cautious. Rumors swirled through London that Catholic factions still dreamed of restoring the old religion. Foreign ambassadors wrote gleefully about the instability of the English court. Spain, defeated but never fully vanquished, kept watch. The death of Elizabeth, they knew, could open a power vacuum the Catholic world would rush to fill. Within the court itself, younger nobles jockeyed for favor. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, and a favorite of Elizabeth in the 1590s, had already met a tragic end, executed for treason after leading a rebellion against the Queen's advisors. His fall had shocked the nation and shaken Elizabeth profoundly. His execution had not been a choice she made lightly. In private, she was said to have wept uncontrollably afterward, haunted by guilt. But Essex's ambition was only one example of a larger issue. The older generation that had built Elizabeth's regime was gone or dying. In their place were ambitious young men who did not share the same reverence for the Queen's image. They saw a declining monarch and a throne soon to be empty. Even within Parliament, once deferential and cautious, murmurs of succession crept into debates. The Queen remained stubborn. She dismissed talk of heirs as if it were impolite, even dangerous. She still signed letters with regal confidence, still presented herself in royal audiences with stern dignity. But everyone could see her grip was loosening. As Elizabeth withdrew, the business of preparing for a post-Elizabethan England moved forward, quietly, cautiously, and often without her knowledge. Yet in one final gesture of loyalty to the crown, her ministers made a pact. Elizabeth would never be told what was already decided. James would succeed her, but she would not be confronted with it. She would not die knowing others had planned for her replacement. This arrangement, a mixture of respect, fear, and political realism, allowed the court to preserve her dignity even as it anticipated her death. It also helped England avoid a bloody succession crisis. When the Queen finally passed, James was proclaimed king with minimal resistance. But in the weeks leading up to her death, the tension at court was palpable. Every misstep was amplified. Every whispered conversation could be construed as treason. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. Elizabeth, though declining, sensed it all. She may have grown quiet, but she was not blind. She knew in her bones that the game had moved on without her. By the final year of her life, Queen Elizabeth was not just surrounded by courtiers. She was surrounded by ghosts, not spectral apparitions in the literal sense, but phantoms of memory, lovers lost, friends buried, regrets never spoken aloud. The grandeur of her chambers, the ornate furnishings and golden tapestries, only served to echo her silence. For a woman who had once commanded the stage of Europe, her final act was achingly private. The Queen had always guarded her emotions. She had ruled not just by decree, but by distance. Yet in her final months, the boundaries she had built began to dissolve. The weight of the past pressed down, and her solitude became haunted by the dead. Most painful of all, perhaps, was the memory of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, the last man who had truly moved her heart. Their relationship had been tempestuous, intense, and deeply complicated. She had adored him, but he had betrayed her. His failed rebellion in 1601 and subsequent execution had broken something in her that never healed. It was said that after signing his death warrant, Elizabeth fell into a long and inconsolable depression. She secluded herself for days, eating little, speaking less. Though she had ordered many executions in her reign, Essex's death carried a unique sorrow. He was not merely a traitor. He had once been her favorite, her sweet Robin. That memory would not let her rest. She kept his ring near her until the end. And then there was Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin, her rival, and the monarch she had condemned to death. Elizabeth had agonized over that decision. For weeks, she delayed signing the warrant. For days after Mary's execution, she claimed she hadn't authorized it. The guilt weighed heavily. Mary was not just a political threat. She was a mirror, another queen, born of royal blood, brought down by forces beyond her control. In condemning Mary, Elizabeth had perhaps seen a premonition of herself, surrounded by advisors, betrayed by ambition, powerless in her final days. Even further back were the ghosts of her childhood. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, beheaded when Elizabeth was just 2 years old. The silence surrounding her mother's memory had always been a shadow in Elizabeth's life. Officially illegitimate for much of her youth, she had clawed her way back into royal favor, but the stain of her mother's execution had never truly lifted. Anne's fate had taught Elizabeth a harsh lesson: that queens were not invincible, that being too visible, too independent, too beloved could be fatal. And so Elizabeth never married. She never shared her power, and in her final days, she shared very little of her pain. But it leaked through, despite her best efforts. Eyewitnesses from the court in early 1603 described a queen racked by long silences, sudden tears, and strange mutterings. She would speak to long-dead friends. She would reach out to no one in particular. She wept without explanation. She refused music, refused her priests, refused the comfort of her ladies-in-waiting. At times, she would sit for hours without moving, only to suddenly rise and pace. She would not sleep, fearing that if she lay down, she would never rise again. In these final weeks, the performance was over. The pageantry had ended. The monarch was gone. Only the woman remained, exhausted, aching, and burdened by memory. Even the light disturbed her. Her chambers were kept dim, curtains drawn, candles flickered low. She seemed to be preparing for the grave before it arrived. And yet, amidst this descent, she never fully let go of control. She refused doctors, refused medicine, refused even to name a successor. She clung to the last fragments of her identity, her will, her silence, her solitude. The ghosts would not leave her, and she, perhaps, did not want them to. They were all she had left, echoes of a lifetime, spent sacrificing intimacy for immortality. In the end, the Virgin Queen was not surrounded by angels or heirs. She was surrounded by absence, by the long shadows of choices made in the name of power. By early March 1603, Elizabeth was a shadow of the queen she once was. Her body had thinned, her voice weakened, and her grip on consciousness flickered. Yet even then, she resisted the natural order of things. She refused to go to bed. Her ladies-in-waiting begged her to rest, but Elizabeth only shook her head. "I see the image of death on my bed," she reportedly said. She would rather collapse upright than surrender lying down. She stood or sat slumped on cushions, fully dressed, for hours and hours, sometimes for days. Doctors attempted to diagnose her, but she refused treatment. She would not be examined, and she would not receive the sacraments. Her mind wandered. She drifted between long silences and cryptic murmurs. Courtiers watched helplessly as the queen who had held together a kingdom now came undone before their eyes. On March 23rd, she could no longer speak clearly. Her attendants pressed her. Whom would she name as successor? She did not utter a name, but according to witnesses, she made a small, unmistakable gesture, a faint movement of her fingers toward her head, forming the shape of a crown. It was taken to mean James. That night, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to be laid upon the floor cushions. Her breathing slowed. She drifted into unconsciousness. She died in the early hours of March 24th, 1603, at Richmond Palace. No final proclamation, no grand farewell, only stillness. The Tudor dynasty died with her. Elizabeth's death sent ripples through England and beyond. She had ruled for 44 years, longer than any English monarch before her. Her passing was not just the end of a reign. It was the end of an era. London entered a period of mourning, but it was mourning laced with tension. For all the affection the people held for Elizabeth, the question of succession still loomed. Fortunately, Robert Cecil's secret correspondence with James VI ensured a peaceful transition. Within hours of Elizabeth's death, James was proclaimed King of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. Elizabeth's funeral procession in April 1603 was a spectacle of sorrow and symbolism. Her coffin was draped in black velvet, surmounted by an effigy of the Queen in her coronation robes. Thousands gathered as the cortege made its way to Westminster Abbey. Some wept openly, others stood in silent reverence. She was buried in the abbey in a vault beneath the tomb of her half-sister, Mary I, a bitter irony given their rivalry in life. Years later, James would erect a magnificent tomb over her grave, inscribed with the words, "Consorts, both in throne and grave, here rest two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary." Her legacy, however, would never be shared. Elizabeth's reign became legend. She was remembered not for her death, but for her unmatched political mind, her cultural patronage, and her defiant presence in a world of kings. She had ruled alone and triumphantly, but her final days revealed the cost of that triumph. In the end, the Virgin Queen died as she had lived, alone, proud, and veiled in myth. Elizabeth's final days are not merely the story of a monarch's passing. They are a meditation on mortality, solitude, and the illusion of invincibility. She had built herself into a symbol, eternal, immaculate, beyond reach. But death, in its quiet cruelty, peeled back the mask. It showed us the woman beneath the crown. It showed us someone who feared irrelevance more than death, who clung to ritual and control even as her body failed her. It showed a queen who, despite being loved by millions, faced her final hour in silence. And yet, even that silence spoke volumes. In her refusal to name a successor aloud, in her unwillingness to lie down, in the last flicker of her regal defiance, Elizabeth reminded the world that power, even at its most fragile, leaves a mark. She left behind a nation transformed, a myth enshrined, and a lesson history has never forgotten. That behind every crown is a human being, and behind every legend, a last breath.